higher education in music. He speaks internationally on the changing context of music in academy and in society. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor McLean to deliver his lecture on educating the mathematical, balancing the equation. Professor McLean.
Thank you. I have to. It's not starting here. Just a minute. Sorry, it's frozen for a moment here. Just a second. Can you assist here? It suddenly froze. Sorry, my screen just froze here, so can you give me a second? I don't know, it just froze. I can't get it to quit or do anything. All right. It's not doing it, that's the thing. It just froze. Yeah, just let me try. I can't get anything. Yeah, I'm gonna have to power off, sorry. Okay, give me another second. This is always the moment where everybody's tenure file comes up on the screen. You know, be very careful about this. I'm still not getting. Yeah, just a minute. It's okay. No, just leave it. Yeah. No idea why it's saying so.
Take the one to start up.
Well, I don't know if we should just try it again. It shouldn't take this long. Okay, one sec. Okay. Oh, thank you, Microsoft. Suddenly, let's do everything. Sorry about this. It's always another first, of course, for these things. Okay. This is an experience I've never had before like this, so I don't know what's going on. Just a sec. Things are not responding. Okay. No, I don't want to report this to Microsoft. Although I might, actually. Okay, just a minute. All right, let's just try again here with this. I'll go faster. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, yes. There's a first for everything. Okay, educating the mathmusical, balancing the equation. The form of this presentation takes the following. I introduce a number of key questions. I don't necessarily answer them on education, mathematical, and musical. Then there's a prelude, which involves my reporting on certain personal educational tragedies, making decisions between physics and music, and finding my element and my tribe. I'll look briefly at international context of education in math and music. And then there's a middle section on development where I report on a number of interdisciplinary research initiatives that I've been involved in and the importance of integrative thinking and collective learning. There's an interlude, which could have been the entire talk, on a mathemusical person, James Stewart, who just passed away in December, mathematician, teacher, musician at McMaster University and the University of Toronto. And then there's a coda where I return to our fundamentals. So some of the key questions. Why do we educate people? How might we do it better? Are there particular ways to develop the mathemusical? At what stages do mathematical and musical paths converge and diverge? What's the position of mathematical learning in higher education, and what's the position of musical training and research in higher education? So why do we educate people? Well, what is education? It's knowledge, skills, values, beliefs of a group of people. It's very important that it has a social context, and it's mostly about intergenerational transfer. How do we do it? Storytelling, discussion, graphics. Today, there's a challenge of demographics, globalization, new technology, some of which you've seen here. It's the responsibility on a global level for UNESCO, and they've just set out an educational strategy in 2015 for 2014 to 2021. Around the year 2000, they came together with a thing called Education for All. And the importance of education for them is what it does for human rights, or in fact, what the human right of education does for many other of our human rights, for public good, for the fulfillment of a sustainable development, etc., leading right up to the potential for peace. It lessens inequality and poverty. And the goal for 2030 is to ensure equitable education and inclusive quality education and lifelong learning for all. It's a tall task, but it's important to reflect on our own privileged position in that vis-a-vis the rest of the globe. So why do we educate people? How might we do it better? One of the challenges, of course, is the word curriculum is the word derives from the Latin for race course. So there's always this sensibility that we are running as quickly as we can through the curriculum, and trying to find balance, which will be a recurrent theme here, is always a challenge. Are there particular ways to develop the mathemusical? Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of ways not to. Trying to balance the use of time and talent and treasure, financial and otherwise and interpersonal, is always tricky. At what stages do these things converge and diverge? Well, there's a lot of convergence. You saw from Professor Bamberger's talk, you heard from Professor Yang's talk, in primary level and secondary level. It's usually there where the sheep and goats moment takes place and the paths split. In higher education, it becomes then difficult to recover the partnership. For many people, it's a vocation, which in the literal sense is a calling. One experiences a calling to music or a calling to mathematics, or in some cases both. My issue with it often is we really cared about mathematics deeply and about the importance for everybody learning it. Wouldn't we do a better job teaching it? Similarly, if we really cared about music, wouldn't we find other ways to do it? Some of those are jump math, which was developed in Canada, and another one, of course, El Sistema, the famous program. I'm not arguing for those things, but at least people are grappling with the problem. Okay, the prelude on personal educational tragedies. Grade 1 class. It's school art. Typically, it's not really an art class, it's a math class, masquerading as an art class. It's a math redux. You're supposed to draw one of something. I'm sitting in the classroom, and I'm trying to figure out what should I do. I draw a tree. I don't know what I'm going to do. Unfortunately, as you see, I made a technical error. I chose a yellow crayon. You can't actually see that, but that's what that says there. I chose a yellow crayon. So I'm sitting there drawing on a piece of newsprint, and I'm drawing a ball. And I'm not sure what I'm going to turn it into, but eventually it looks like a monad. It looks like, and then I said, well, one is kind of lonely there, so if I put little dots around it, Jungian scintilla you might recognize, then I turned it into a snowball fight. Well, what of course happened was the teacher came by, asked me what I was doing, and decided that I really wasn't doing the task of applying art to mathematics. In grade 2, I began piano lessons. In our culture, we started with CDE and CBA. Of course, I came back after the first lesson and said, you can play these things simultaneously, and if you shift them around, you can do a lot more than that. So, I was doing this. So my point is, at that moment in my career, a theorist was born. I was aware of inversional diatonic symmetry. I was told, however, just to play the notes, and at that point, an improv musician died. So turning points for all of us. This is epigraph number 1, Yogi Berra, New York Yankees, famous for his malapropisms. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Now this actually had meaning in Yogi's house, because if you took the left fork or the right fork, they both came back together and you could still get to Yogi's place. That's a reality. But the idea, when you come to a fork, take it. At age 15 for me, was it physics or was it music? This is with the moment of divergence and convergence, and for me the turning point came when I was speaking in a class about Leonard Bernstein's Joy of Music and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I was invited to talk to my peers. At that point it became clear to me that I was really interested in musical structure, in the creative process, and in teaching. I also found, as Ken Robinson says, my element and my tribe, the thing that you want to do and the group of people you want to do it with. One more little story from Ken there. A picture of God. This is what happened to another kid in an art class. She's sitting there drawing a picture. And the teacher comes and says, "What are you drawing?" And she says, intent on her work, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "Well, that's very challenging because people don't really know what God looks like." And the kid looked up from her drawing and said, "They will in a minute." Capturing that capacity for creativity in children is something we need to preserve, of course, all the time. But I'm often asked why we chose music, because a lot of us here chose music, and we must have been, in Robinson's words, out of our minds. I'm usually asked by anxious parents who want to know why their child would do music as opposed to anything else in education, which would be clearly better. My short answer is hormones. Seriously, most people make this move, if they're not prodigies, at a moment in their lives where they're deeply touched by emotional situations. They're teens or preteens. It's also usually a mentor or a role model in their class that they can really identify with that individual. Of course, it's true in math and other things as well. The World Health Organization points out that to be well-being is physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual. And one of the interesting things about music and the performing arts is it's one of the few activities that combines all of those things simultaneously. So when do we choose? Well, I'm often asked that. I've been admitted to pre-med or engineering, and I've been admitted to music. Now, we try to make it possible for you to do both of those things, but there is a challenge because of the athleticism of music. If you are a musical athlete, think of it for the Olympics. You can't really put yourself in a situation where you say, you know, I'm an Olympic swimmer, but I'm going to take 10 years off and finish my law degree, and then I'll go back and try to be an Olympic swimmer. There are moments in music where you have to do it early on. Along the way, we have twists and turns. We start to understand it's not just a race, a curriculum, but a journey. Tom Peters, the famous business guru, pointed out that most CVs are constructed as if they're a series of successes, but they're actually a series of failures. I thought I was going to do this, and then something else happened, and I did that instead. That's mostly our reality. So my to-do list, my regular to-do list, always has two headers, physics and music, and the balance between them. The physics part is about physical, of course, scientific thinking, but it's also, working out, doing some things to look after the body. The music one is music, emotional, subjective, doing music. This harkens back to Carl Palnak, who's the head of the Boston Conservatory, in a famous speech he made in 2004, first time, where he talked about the Greeks' relationship to physics and music, where physics was the observable, external, and celestial permanent objects, and music was everything else, the invisible, internal, and humanly ephemeral. We've talked about the quadrivium and the trivium before, but the trivium is an interesting one because it's language, logic, and what we would now call presentation skills. So now I'm 60 years old, I've got 2 kids, and I've moved essentially from being a musician to mergers and acquisitions. Most of the time I do administrative work. The Schulich School of Music, chair of the board of Kermit, that's how that's said, like the frog, Kermit. And then back to the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Music and a couple of other things. I'm still tilting at windmills. Here's the educational international context. If you look at the OECD rankings of 15-year-old students, the PISA 2012 that you've been doing every 3 years since 2000, 65 countries, 510,000 students representing 28 million worldwide. In math, science, and reading, as you know, Shanghai, number 1 recently, Singapore, always number 2 and number 3. Congratulations to my host country here. Extraordinary achievement. Canada's kicking down around 13, 11, 8 for these things, and the US is actually below the average, which is a huge challenge for them in their educational system. In the Canadian context, the challenges of geography, of the complexity of immigration, the diversity of the population, and the fact that education is state-run, provincially run rather than federal, is a challenge. If you look at the difference between Canada and the GTA, which is the Greater Toronto Area, and Singapore, we have about 10 times the area of Singapore in the GTA with the same population, roughly. So this is what this looks like when you look at the page, and you could read all kinds of cool stuff off this if you think about it. For example, notice that the Swiss are still bankers. They're there at number 9. They do math, but they don't really care about sciences and reading. You see where Canada is, you see where the others are, and actually all 6 people in Liechtenstein are clearly right. So you look at the university rankings, Times Higher Education and that, of course, California Institute of Technology, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, the usual suspects. U of T is actually 20th on the list, and NUS here is 25th. That's an extraordinary achievement for partially publicly funded institutions. But it's interesting in the arts and humanities that U of T is actually much higher than that, University of Toronto and McGill, whereas the National University of Singapore is 42nd in that. There's all kinds of reasons for these things, but it's interesting to see what people might value. So what's the place of mathematics in higher education? Well, if you look at those rankings, you can get data rankings for physical science, for engineering technology, for life sciences, for clinical health sciences, for social sciences and arts and humanities. There is no pull down for math. Math. This is why, because math, of course, affects all of these things and is in the academy the highest of the high. But in terms of its sorting in university rankings, it doesn't show up there. It's embedded in all these other ones. If you look up music, on the other hand, thank you, what you get is industry sale figures. There is nothing about Billboard, etc. There's nothing about music that way. We're actually trying to create that now in quality assurance within the European Union, and you'll be part of that process. Okay, moving to the next part, development. So over the years, I've been involved in a number of interdisciplinary research initiatives, Kermit at McGill, MARC, the Music and Health Research Collaboratory, and a couple of recent ones. I've also been involved in the European conservatories, and one of the challenges is to get people across disciplines working together. In there, we came up with 5 themes: artistic research, new technologies, professional development, pedagogy, and community engagement. What it takes in every case when I review institutions is 6 S's: quality of staff, quality of support, quality of students, structure, space, and the last one's a $sign, money. It also requires a coherent vision for teaching, research, and service. I'm going to take a quick look at these. So here's Kermit. What it does, well, it's a multidisciplinary, multi-university, multi-faculty, multi-departmental unit. It's also a 30-year overnight success. All right, people thought it was instant success, and it looks very logical in retrospect, but it was because over the years you had the Electronic Music Studio, see the codes there, EMS, sound recording, music technology, the Montreal Neurological Institute, and it was a question of bringing all these things together. Again, by the time I left Kermit, it was the #1 ranked research center in Quebec in any discipline. Had an A+ ranking in all categories, and part of the reason for that is we let our students free. The students organized most of the colloquy and most of the visitors. So there were a number of leaders involved in this thing, and the idea behind Kermit was to go through from the creation in the mind of the composer, through performance, through recording and transmission, through the mind of the listener, and in each of these cases on the right, you see some of the scientific fields and practices that are involved in each. So there were 6 research axes. It's important to organize things this way. Now there are 4: instruments, devices, music information research, cognition, perception, expanded musical practice. The 8 p.m. thing refers to the fact that if you're playing around with this new technology, at 8 p.m. the curtain goes up and it's got to work. It's no longer a demo. As you saw in some of the things here, it has to work at that point. So it puts a lot of pressure on the technologists and on the musicians to get things that actually function. It's also about space. We put a new building in. There were 6 communal labs, that's important, on the top floor, and 3 major live spaces down below, including the MMR. I'm going to show you a couple of those. This is the critical listening room. They're not very large, but they're very precisely oriented to their task, and they're not the property of a single PI. They're shared facilities for projects. This is a surround dome that allows you to recreate artificial spaces inside a performance space, and I'll show a couple of projects that deal with that in a moment. This is the big room, the MMR. It's slightly larger than Abbey Road in London. That's Kent Nagano, you see bent over there in the cardigan, because it's a Montreal Symphony Orchestra recording. This is the same space set up for the equivalent of that surround sound, but over the entire area. So sample projects. I like to talk about 3 of these things. One of them is gestural analysis. The other is the T-stick. When you've seen a few human-computer interface objects here. One of the interesting things for us in our field of music is that human-computer interfaces have to be practicable. You have to want to play them. You have to see that when you work with them that you get better. One of our disasters or utter failures was the musical udder. It essentially had an interface that involved looking like you were milking a cow. Not that, successful for people. So that one didn't work so well. The T-stick, however, was great. My favorite project is the virtual Haydn one, where inside that dome, we recorded all of the keyboard works of Haydn. It was released as the first Naxos Blu-ray, and it had 7 real musical instruments that Haydn would have worked on, and 9 spaces, which were emulated inside the dome. I'm going to show you just one because it's relevant to student players, etc. And this is the people who did it: Marcello Wanderly, Lambert Chen. It was his doctoral project, and he's now the associate principal of viola at Montreal. IRCAM was involved with the censors, etc. And it's about the pedagogy of visualization and feedback. Here's the example. This is a violin bow. It shows the angle, the pressure, the direction, and this is what's really fun for students to learn. String crossing, and then when you get to the bariolage, it will trace a figure 8. Lambert, being the obsessive violist violinist that he was, of course, kept working to get that 8 more and more perfect. But it's an interesting example of the technology being used for a very practical pedagogical purpose. Now I'm in Toronto, and I'm doing something on the Music and Health Research Collaboratory, again, interdisciplinary, interlaboratory, interdepartmental. It was established in Toronto in 2012, and it's an example of the bagel effect, or a spokes but no hub. What happened is I came back and I was looking for something that was similar inside a university environment, a research-intensive university environment to Kermit, and I found that the action there was mostly in the clinical health area, and that, in fact, there were all kinds of people working on cochlear implants, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, stroke rehab, multiple disabilities, pain relief, and drug efficacy, all related to music, but they'd never talked to each other. So putting them together into an interdisciplinary research environment was the new goal. It has 5 axes, which you can sort of see laid out there around the principle of sound health, and this is what they are: medicine and therapy, and particularly the distinction between the two. Music therapy is about the relationship between the therapist and the patient mediated by music. Music medicine is take 2 songs and call me in the morning. It's about direct impact of music on the patient. Body, brain, and mind, society and culture. We have a lot of ethnomusicologists, but it's a move from ethnomusicology to public policy. Science and health of performance, of course. We've hosted the ISPS Performance Studies Conference and also the Performing Arts Medical Association. And then music and human development related to, because music is the first thing to come, often in the way in children's development, and it's the last thing to go in Alzheimer's. So it's a really interesting lifelong reality. One very quick one on the mind-brain behavior hive, which just started last year. The challenge is, how do we use new technology in mind-brain science to transform education and self-development? What's the opportunity? Well, brain science and technology-based personal learning has evolved to the point where skill transfer and trait development can be tracked and measured with accuracy. The leadership there is McLean, and it's an interesting example because he was a 12-year-old gifted student in my Royal Conservatory class years ago, went on, still plays piano, but went on to MIT and Harvard, and is now running the Desautels Center for Integrative Thinking. So the idea here is we have neuroplastic realities now. If you learn juggling, it changes things in your brain. We can actually track this stuff. You can then measure it. EEG, camera measures. We're actually using Google Glass for that. Microphone measures, EKG, respiration. And this is part of giving people, I know it sounds a little Frankensteinian. Don't forget McLean of Moldaviano is Transylvanian. But the idea is very much providing the learner with the kind of feedback that's necessary for this. What we're trying to do in this instance is work from the brain science lab to the experimental classroom to the real classroom on a loop. And as I said, one of the things is the glass room, which is to use Google Glass as a tool for engaging between the teacher and the learner and remote activities from that, including all of the various bodily measurements. Okay, I'm now at my interlude. James Stewart. Epigraph number 2, Albert Einstein. If I were a physicist, if I were not a physicist, I would be a musician. So this is about Jim Stewart, who's a mathematician, musician, architectural advocate, rights advocate, philanthropist, and best-selling author of, wait for it, calculus textbooks. There's Jim. It's a reminder, take your name tag off when they take your picture in front of the center that's named after you, because probably people know who you are. But there you are. And here's Jim in his environment teaching calculus class. You see, people are all laughing in calculus class, which I think is a useful thing. He went to Stanford, did his PhD at Toronto, and then London postdoc with Lionel Cooper. While he did that, he also studied at Guildhall. Mathematician specialist in harmonic analysis, teacher, the Center for Mathematics in Hamilton, the Fields Institute in Toronto, named after J.C. Fields, the Fields Medal, who was Canadian and from Hamilton, actually, originally. As a musician, Jim was active as a violinist, chamber musician, and orchestral player. He was the concert master of the university orchestra and played in the professional orchestra. He was also an impresario and hosted tons of events in his home. So other interests, architectural innovation, rights advocate, philanthropist, and there's a number of Mathematical Association of America's interviews and talks and that where he talked a lot about music and math. Some of the things he said were, if you're a university person, remarkably you find out a lot of crossover between music and math and science. What are the similarities between them? We've talked about some of these here: precision, notation, abstraction. The history of prodigies. It's unusual that prodigies are in math and music. What is that? It has to do with abstraction in part. That's to say there are very few prodigy historians. because it has to do with acquiring the knowledge in the field rather than manipulating the abstracts. Birkhoff's aesthetic measure, which you may know about in information theory, 1933, Jim's quip about that was, maybe a better measure would be the number of times you can stand to listen to a piece of music before you never want to hear it again. Music and math, rhythm, harmony, melody, form, he talks about all of these. He talks about Steve Reich's clapping music, because Russell Hartenberger, my predecessor at Toronto, is the leading authority on Reich's music, and the two of them would perform together in Jim's home. The melody. He spent a lot of time on 12-tone music, Berg and the Beatles. It's worth taking a look at. And his most important thing, he felt, was the relationship between form and music, topological space manipulations, geometric transforms, which you'll hear about more this afternoon, and structure, mathematical structure and elegance therein. But here's a bunch of textbooks. So he wrote tons of these textbooks, which were hugely successful. I just want to show you the picture of the covers. Biocalculus, recently Brief Applied, but the main ones were the main calculus books. He did them several times for people. Early transcendentals for the mathematically oriented, early vectors for the engineering oriented. But isn't it lovely that the integral pun that takes place, because the F hole in the violin, of course, the sign for the integral function, is what he used all the time in his covers. The other cool thing about it, and I encourage the students to go take a look, is on the supporting website. There's all this additional information. Lies my calculator and computer told me, reviews of algebra, etc. Projects, challenge things, problem-solving course, which he developed at Toronto after his work with George Polya at Stanford. Calculus texts sold millions, which allowed him to help build the James Stewart Center for Mathematics. That's the outside, 1929. This is the inside. And for all you math people out there, you'll just drool at all that wonderful blackboard space, which is built in throughout. His home looked like this, and was all about curved features and working with architects to develop calculus angles inside the spaces for human use. We have winter in Canada, so this is a picture of the back from the ravine. There's the snow. But inside, it's really interesting the way in which the levels integrate together, the angles of the space. It's not all concrete. This is a more private area in the back, the mirror stair. And then this is the performance space, which is a beautiful space that looks out onto the ravine. I get to my coda. So key questions. I started, you'll notice, with key questions and a prelude on personal tragedies and the history of internationalism in these areas of math and music. And then I went to the development and the interlude about Jim Stewart. Now I'm at the coda. You'll notice, and this brings us to epigraph number 3, that there was no main theme. This is a letter that Alban Berg wrote to his pupil Hans Erik Apostel, who gave him a sonata sketch, and Berg said that it's very hard for me to critique your sonata sketch because above all I miss a main theme, a real melodic idea that one could develop. It's one of the most scathing criticisms we know, because at the end of it he says, and this I hope does not apply to my talk, is that it's better than, you should bring in a real idea and develop it and let it build. It's better than nursing a nothing, however rich in cross-reference. So this is Berg on the lack of the main theme. So let's look at a couple of these things that we've been talking about in the last few days. In creativity, compositional work with mathematics, generating material with mathematics, and the normal idea of problem solving, learning by mistake. One more story here. I was a Suzuki parent, so my son was working on a piece of music, and of course I wanted it to come out correctly. So he would do the A section and the B section, he'd get back to the A section, and he would do something else. I'm a music theorist. I said, it's the A section, it's the same thing as it was before, you do it over again. Fights, fisticuffs, etc. Finally, I quiet down. He plays the whole thing from beginning to end perfectly. And I said, Dante, how did that happen? And he said, well, you see, I learned it by mistake. We have to make sure that we leave enough room for people to learn stuff by mistake. The technique related to both fields, the notation, the problem-solving ability, the need for strategic practice. Of course, this is a healthy learning situation that's required in music, or you end up with all kinds of strain syndromes. In interpretation, the interaction between people, the performance and applications of performance, and the balance between discipline and expression that is required in these fields. The importance of improvisation in problem-solving and learning by mistake. Most of our institutions in music have abandoned improvisation or relegated it to the jazz department or certain small areas of contemporary music. Classical music was always improvisational in nature, and one of our biggest challenges is to recover that, the importance of play. Play in English, spielen auf Deutsch, jouer en français. I don't know what they all are in other languages, but this idea of play with the material is important. We've talked about some of the analysis ones already, and in the terms of the impact of musical study and mathematical study on society, the social, cultural, and economic one, my only point is that it's dangerous to be too instrumental, to say that if you do this, then that will happen. Both of these things have their wonderful qualities, and it's important to be balanced in them. Affect, aesthetics, emotional impact. Yesterday I touched on peak performance, and with apologies to Paul, the whole thing is ein schönes Feld, or ein herrliches Gebiet. This is a wonderful experience that we have, and trying to balance imbalance is one of the key features of arts, why we do it. So I'm going to talk, just to close here, about peak experience lifting or gating functions. When a piece takes flight, this happens more often, of course, with great pieces and great players, but it also happens in unexpected circumstances. How many people of the theory know David Huron, the neurocognition specialist, one of the great music theorists in that area? Well, David turned out he was at a performance that my wife did of Peter Pan. I'd forgotten he was there. A couple of years later at a theory conference, I met him in New York, and I said, "David, have you met my wife?" And he said, "Yes, I did. I cried all the way through Act 3 of her Peter Pan." What happened is the kid who was playing Peter Pan sprinkled the fairy dust, and the whole thing lifted for the rest of the performance. It's interesting to figure out how that happens. If you've seen Shakespeare in Love, the movie, you'll know that on opening night, the tailor who has to be the prologue is a stutterer. Two families torn by strife. So you're waiting, it's terribly tense until finally it clicks in and the thing launches and you're underway and it takes off. I also mentioned Edward O. Wilson's comment about music, the role of music in analytical math, but the most important thing for us is that the role of music is about training the emotions through people's use. It emulates the emotional experience of life, it prepares us for the vicissitudes, the ups and downs of life, and it helps us frame our activities in that way. So the mathematical affect, I talked briefly yesterday in the panel about it. We have different kinds of affect, I would say, and it's a spectrum, of course, and overlapping. The affect, which is intellectually contemplative, aesthetic, when you look at the famous equations in that, and the moment of discovery, the epiphany of discovery, the Bach-Goldberg we heard, the balance of the whole with the exquisite detail. In jazz, Csikszentmihalyi called this groove, flow, coolness. In Mozart, you have the balance of these things, but you also have the dark side, the drama jocosa. The power of an affect of more emotionally visceral impact, and that's, as I said, I've taught courses in this, Bruckner and heavy metal, the frisson factor, the voice of God, and of course the symphony orchestra as an affect engine. So last thing, I'm going to step outside, and I'm closing with this, and give you one example of peak performance. And the challenges are how we're going to pull this both into theory and into mathematical conversations about it. This is the Vogue or voice of God sequence. There's usually a confusium of some kind of the introduction. Think of the beginning of Beethoven's Ninth or Bruckner's Third, an Ungrund, an unformedness. Not Urgrund, Ungrund. Real-time cameras in this case and voiceover and backstage stuff will accomplish this. Lowering of expectations. Vaulting of expectations when all of us move from the rational and critical to the affective. Surrendering of expectations, a moment of entrainment where you're pulled into the work. Loss of equilibrium, discombobulation, and climax. And then finally the aftermath or afterglow or afterburn, a sense of amazement and effect. With apologies, here's the piece.
But for the next contestant, the world of showbiz seems a million miles away.
It's Paul, a mobile phone salesman from South Wales.
By day, I sell mobile phones. My dream is to spend my life doing what I feel that I was born to do.
Paul, what are you here for today, Paul?
To sing opera. I've always wanted to sing as a career. Confidence has always been sort of like a difficult thing for me. I've always found it a little bit difficult to be completely confident in myself.
Okay, ready when you are.
Expecting a lot, as you can see.
So you work at Car Phone Warehouse.
Right. So you work at Car Phone Warehouse, right? So this is, of course, totally artificial, right? This is Nessun Dorma. It's not the whole piece, as you know. And Caliph, when Caliph normally sings this thing, is 2 hours into a performance, and there's more to it than this. But the point I'm making is that everyone experienced the affect of that thing, and we still don't know quite how to manage it. So this is a really interesting challenge for the future. This is what the text says there. Of course, if you don't know the piece at the end, she doesn't know his name. It's a secret name, and he has to guess it. And so this is all a part of the mystery of the thing. And then at the end, vanish, O night, set stars, at dawn I will win. That's the Vincero, Vincero at the end. So there's again the elements in a typical Vogue sequence: the confusium, the lowering of expectations, the vaulting of expectations, the move from rational to effective, entrainment, amazement, aftermath, or one might say, after Mathemusical. Thank you.